Welcome to Part 3 of the voiceover lecture for Chapter 7, the Nervous System. If you haven't already, watch Parts 1 and 2. So far, we've already covered Sections 1, 2, and 3. In this video, we'll cover Section 4 on the spinal cord and spinal nerves, and Section 5, the reflexes. In the next video, we'll talk about the brain and cranial nerves. Section 4, the spinal cord and spinal nerves. I've divided this section into two parts. In Part 1, we will discuss the spinal cord, and in Part 2, the spinal nerves. Let's begin with the spinal cord. The spinal cord is surrounded by many structures that protect it. The spinal cord is very delicate and has very little ability to repair itself when damaged. The spinal cord is absolutely essential for most of the movements of our body and many of our body's senses. So it makes sense to have many layers protecting it. The spinal cord is surrounded by a bony structure called the vertebral column, also called the backbone, which is composed of many stacked vertebrae separated by cartilaginous intervertebral discs. Each vertebrae has a large hole called the vertebral foramen. The vertebral foramen of each vertebrae is lined up, creating a channel called the vertebral canal. This is where the spinal cord is housed. This bony structure is the main protective shelter for the spinal cord. In addition to the vertebral column, the spinal cord is also protected by 3 layers of tissue called the meninges. Between these layers are several spaces that also serve the spinal cord. We'll discuss each layer and space in order from the most superficial to the most deep. That is, the layer that's furthest to the outside of the body towards the layer that's the closest to the spinal cord. We'll start with the epidural space, then go to the Dura Mater, subdural space, Arachnoid Mater, Subarachnoid Space, and finally the Pia Mater. First, let's discuss the epidural space. The epidural space is located between the Dura Mater and the vertebrae. It is superficial to the Dura Mater, hence the name. The epidural space contains nerve roots, which is the initial segment of a nerve. It also contains blood and lymphatics and connective tissue, particularly adipose tissue that forms a fatty cushion. You may have heard of an epidural. This is usually when an anesthetic is administered to the epidural space for pain relief, especially during labor. The arrow below is pointing towards the epidural space, which is usually indicated by that fatty layer. The Dura Mater, the first meninge, is the toughest and strongest of the 3 meninges, and its name means hard mother. The Dura Mater is composed of connective tissue and is indicated at the very tip of the arrow in the drawing below. Deep to the Dura Mater is the subdural space, hence its name. The subdural space is filled with interstitial fluid. That's the fluid that's found between all of our cells. You can see the subdural space at the very tip of the arrow in the diagram below. Next we have the Arachnoid Mater, or spider-like meninge. It gets its name from the fact that the tissue looks like a web. The Arachnoid Mater is composed of cells, elastin, and collagen fibers. You can see the Arachnoid Mater indicated at the tip of the arrow in the diagram below. Next is the Subarachnoid Space. This space contains blood vessels and cerebrospinal fluid. The subarachnoid space provides nutrition to the spinal cord. You may have heard of a spinal tap or lumbar puncture. This is a procedure where a needle is inserted into the space for diagnostic testing. You can see the subarachnoid space at the tip of the arrow in the diagram below. Lastly, we have the Pia Mater, or delicate mother. The Pia Mater directly adheres to the spinal cord, and it's a very thin layer of delicate tissue. You can see the Pia Mater indicated at the very tip of the arrow in the diagram below. Here we have an unlabeled diagram of the spinal cord and vertebral column. To the left is a cross-section of the vertebrae, showing the spinal cord at the center, and to the right is a side view of the vertebral column, with the spinal cord extending outward from the top. This is the same diagram as the previous slide, with all of the parts labeled. Take a moment to familiarize yourself with the various meninges and the spaces in between. Now let's discuss the anatomy of the spinal cord. In a cross-section, the spinal cord appears oval-shaped. The spinal cord is continuous with the part of the brain called the brain stem and travels down the vertebral column. It terminates in the lumbar vertebrae. There's a tiny canal that runs the length of the spinal cord. It appears as a small hole in the center of the spinal cord in a cross-section, as indicated by the arrow. The central canal is filled with cerebrospinal fluid, providing the spinal cord with nutrients. The outer layer of the spinal cord is white matter, so termed because it appears relatively light in color. The white matter is composed of myelinated axons. Recall that myelin is a fatty layer that insulates axons. This fatty tissue is what gives the white matter its appearance. Deeper is the gray matter. Gray matter is unmyelinated and therefore has a lower lipid content and appears darker. The gray matter of the spinal cord appears to have an H shape or butterfly shape in a cross-section. In the diagram to the left, the posterior or dorsal side of the spinal cord is oriented upward, while the anterior or ventral side is oriented downward. Like the previous slide, the diagram to the left is a cross-section of the spinal cord. These colored lines represent neurons, where the line represents an axon, the dot represents the cell body or soma, and the fork at the end is the axon terminal. Because of the orientation of these lines in this diagram, you can see that information is going to travel in this direction. The blue lines represent sensory neurons carrying information to the spinal cord. The purple line represents short interneurons that just relay information from one neuron to the next. You can see that these two neurons synapse in this region of the gray matter right here. This region is termed the dorsal horn. Sensory neurons carry information into the spinal cord. The surrounding white matter around the dorsal horn contains long myelinated neurons that travel up to the brain, and they carry that sensory information up to the brain. These regions are termed the ascending tracts. You can also see in this diagram that those short interneurons, which were colored purple, also synapse with motor neurons, colored red. These neurons target muscles or glands. You can see those right here. The region of the gray matter, where these interneurons synapse with motor neurons, is called the ventral horn. Surrounding the ventral horn is white matter. This white matter contains long myelinated neurons that come from the brain and bring motor information down through the spinal cord. These regions are termed descending tracts. Here's an unlabeled diagram representing a cross-section of the spinal cord. You could use this to practice labeling the spinal cord's various parts. Here's the same picture with all of the parts labeled. Focus on the parts that we've discussed in previous slides. Now let's discuss the spinal nerves, but first we should explore the structure of nerves in general. Nerves are surrounded by a layer of tissue called the epineurium. Within the epineurium are bundles of axons called fascicles. And fascicles are surrounded by a layer of connective tissue called the perineurium. The endoneurium is a layer of connective tissue that surrounds each individual axon. This diagram shows a cross-section of a nerve. Remember, nerves are composed of many bundles of neurons. Neurons have those long extensions called axons. Each axon is surrounded by a layer of connective tissue called the endoneurium. Endo means inside. These axons are all bundled together and surrounded by a layer called the perineurium. These bundles of axons are known as fascicles. Fascicles are all bundled together in this larger structure called the nerve, which is surrounded by a layer of connective tissue called the epineurium. Within nerves, you will also find blood vessels that help provide nutrients to the neurons inside. Now let's discuss the distribution of spinal nerves in our body. Like all nerves, spinal nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system. Like all nerves, spinal nerves connect to the central nervous system. In this case, they connect to the spinal cord. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, 31 on the left, 31 on the right, for a total of 62 individual nerves. The spinal nerves exit our vertebral column through holes called intervertebral foramen. There are 8 pairs of cervical nerves. These are the nerves in our neck region. There are 12 thoracic nerves. These are the nerves in our chest area. There are 5 pairs of spinal nerves in our lumbar region or lower back, 5 pairs in the sacral region below that, and 1 pair of coccygeal nerves at the very base of our spine. Some of our spinal nerves merge and separate to form a network known as a plexus. There are 4 major plexuses in our body. First, we have the cervical plexus, which serves our neck, head, shoulders, and diaphragm. Next, we have a brachial plexus, which serves our upper limbs, our neck, and our shoulders. The lumbar plexus serves our abdominal wall, genitals, and lower limbs, and the sacral plexus serves our buttocks, genitals, and lower limbs. This diagram shows our spinal nerves and the regions of the spinal cord with which they correspond. So these 8 spinal nerves are in the cervical region of our spinal column, hence they're termed cervical nerves. These 12 pairs of nerves in this red region are our thoracic nerves, which correspond to the thoracic vertebrae. Here in purple we have our lumbar nerves, which correspond to the lumbar vertebrae, sacral nerves below, which corresponds to the sacrum, and the coccygeal nerves, a single pair of nerves, which corresponds to the coccyx. Section 5, the reflexes. A reflex is a rapid and involuntary response to a stimulus. Reflexes might be inborn, that is, we're born with them, and some reflexes we learn over time. Some of our inborn reflexes are lost as we develop into adults. We believe reflexes have a protective function and that we don't waste time thinking about our response. An example of a reflex is the patellar reflex, or knee-jerk response. The knee-jerk response is used to determine the health of our peripheral nervous system. A doctor might tap just below your kneecap, and your leg kicks out in response. Specific reflexes always occur along the same pathway of neurons. This is known as a reflex arc. Again, it's the neural pathway over which a reflex occurs. Reflex arcs are always unidirectional. They always occur in the same direction. There are 2 types of reflex arcs. Somatic reflexes stimulate skeletal muscles, and autonomic reflexes regulate smooth muscle, the heart, and glands. The patellar reflex discussed previously is a somatic reflex. The pupillary reflex, which changes the size of our pupil in response to light, is an example of an autonomic reflex. Here we have a diagram depicting the reflex arc of the patellar reflex, or knee-jerk response. Here you can see there's sensory neurons embedded in the muscles of the leg, which detect when something strikes the knee. They'll send a signal up through afferent or sensory neurons into the dorsal side of the spinal cord, where they synapse with short interneurons in the gray matter of the spinal cord. Notice sensory neurons always synapse in the dorsal horn of the gray matter. The short interneuron will synapse with a efferent or motor neuron on the ventral horn of the gray matter and send its information down back into those leg muscles where they'll tell them to contract. This is one example of a reflex arc. You need not memorize all of the details of this particular example. Just understand the concept and flow of information in a reflex arc. And that's it for part 3 for the voiceover lecture of Chapter 7, the nervous system. Stay tuned for part 4.